This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
I think that conservatives feel like it's a highly orchestrated plan against them, and it is simply not, right? I remember hearing it's care and fairness as a cultural value played out into the world everywhere, right? I have never ever been in a room, and I used to do political things. I've never been in a room where someone said, if we can get more immigrants into the United States, then we'll win more elections.
Mm.
I don't think anybody's thinking of that.
The Village Square, a nervy bunch of liberals and conservatives who believe that disagreement and dialogue make for a good conversation, a good country, and a good time. At the Village Square, we talk about politics, religion, and race. You know, the topics your mom taught you never to discuss in polite company. Listen, at the Village Square, we make pigs fly.
Hey folks, welcome to Village Squarecast. This is Corey Nathan. So glad to be with you again. Thank you for joining us for Conservative 101 for Liberals and Liberal 101 for Conservatives, or Empathy 101 for everyone. Village Squarecast is funded in part by Florida Humanities with support from Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Mellon Foundation. This conversation is our latest edition of the Flying Pig Academy. And once again, we are lucky to be joined by our Flying Pig Academy professors, Liz Joyner, Village Square's founder and CEO, and Bill Maddox, the former board chair of the Village Square and senior director of the J. Stanley Marshall Center for Education Freedom at the James Madison Institute. In this conversation, Liz and Bill take up one of the most persistent and consequential questions of our time. Why do people who share so many fundamental concerns so often talk past one another? What do liberals misunderstand about conservatives? Where do conservatives misread liberal intentions? And what becomes possible when curiosity replaces suspicion and empathy replaces caricature? So settle in and enjoy this thoughtful and generous conversation with Liz and Bill, and I will see you on the other side with some closing thoughts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square, and welcome back for another episode of Flying Pig Academy on Village Squarecast. Our topic today, again, with our two-title tradition, is, I'm looking for the title right now because it is Conservative 101 for Liberals and Liberal 101 for Conservatives, or Empathy 101 for everyone. And joining me today is Bill Maddox, Dr. Bill Maddox of the Flying Pig Academy. No tenure, but lots of appreciation. Bill is at James Madison Institute, which is just a wonderful organization. I hope you'll take a minute to look them up online. So this actually really does put us kind of squarely in what the Village Square has done all these years, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if there's anything that defines us, is that we're always trying to understand people who don't think like us better than we do.
That's right. It's good.
And so I think this is mostly, unless you can kind of help me a little bit here, this is probably mostly going to be Conservative 101 for liberals, because that's been my walk. And I also, and I think I've said to you before, although I don't know that you'd agree with me completely, that I do think that there is more cultural misunderstanding of conservatives than there is vice versa. And some of that, the reasons for that is based in Dr. Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. And I'll do a quick buzz through about that, say a little bit about why I think it's related, and then you can jump in. So the 6 moral foundations, and John asks you to think of it like almost the slider on a stereo system. that, people sort of have varying degrees of everything. The first is care and harm. The second is fairness, cheating. Um, and those two are really important because his data says that both liberals and conservatives are, in fact, at the same, um, have the same amount of those moral foundations. So both groups care as much, are concerned about preventing harm as much, care about fairness as much, and want to avoid cheating as much. But then the rest of the moral foundations are broadly in the category of what John calls the binding moral foundation. So kind of the more groupish ones, and that's loyalty and betrayal, authority subversion, sanctity degradation, liberty oppression. And so to me, especially loyalty and authority, all these years, and again, it isn't that, I mean, any theory is only, so good, right? You don't want to overdo it. But I definitely have come to believe that, consistent with John's theory, I have seen in real life that people who are more liberal like I am, I'm center left, um, are particularly focused on those first two, care and fairness moral foundations. Um, to and even see some things that are negative about loyalty and authority, and of course, all of us could agree that, taken to, extremes, there are reasons to be suspicious and worrisome about those things. Um, but that, uh but that tends to be sort of the liberal view of the universe, and maybe on the most, we enter more rooms with that on our mind, right? And to me, it was a revelation because I think that many liberals, because they're so focused on care and fairness, um, they read conservatives having more of a multi-channel, a six-channel morality instead of more of a two-channel morality. They read what conservatives do as being mean and uncaring. And so to me, it's such a revelation to think, well, no, conservatives don't care less than you do about fairness and care. They just have to balance their caring over a larger number of moral goods. And so I think that immigration is a really good example, uh, that I feel like I've learned from this theory, and then also from knowing conservatives, that it isn't that they care less about immigrants who are fleeing desperate situations, or immigrants who are whose lives are so in crisis that they have to come to this country illegally. It's that they have to think, well, there's laws that, they more center, there's laws we have to follow because we have to have these rules. Some other people are in line before them, and we have to care about that. And so that's authority, and loyalty is we have to care for the people who live here first, right? We owe a duty of obligation that's higher. So, that's sort of a kind of a quick spin through of what I think one of the significant misunderstandings that I see people who are on my side of the aisle, convey towards conservatives, and I think it's truly a misunderstanding.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think you've expressed that well. The only thing I would add to that is just that part of the reason why I, I think you're right in saying that there is probably in our day, at least in this moment in time, we often find, at least in our work at Village Square, we often find that we have to do more to explain conservatives to liberals
Yeah.
than to explain liberals to conservatives. And the only thing that I would add to your description of kind of how they each come to some of these different topics and how, yes, conservatives have more categories that they seem to want to try to consider on some of these things than liberals do. But the big thing in my mind is just that we live in what I think is or has been for quite some time a kind of liberal age. And so anytime someone is in a minority position and kind of living in, it's kind of like a person who goes to a foreign country and you're living in a foreign culture, you're going to see things that the people that are there all the time and notice things and observe things that people who are there all the time might miss because it's just in the atmosphere that they breathe or whatnot. And so I I think because conservatives tend or have tended to be kind of in the weaker position for some time in
Mhm.
our culture,
Mhm.
if you're living in a kind of liberal world in and kind of breathing in and drinking in liberalism day after day just because that's the culture, the dominant cultural um ethos or vibe or philosophy or whatnot, then you're gonna just necessarily, it's not that conservatives are somehow more astute or more observant or have better instincts than liberals do. I think it's just that they've been in a weaker position. Therefore, they probably have a better understanding of liberalism than vice versa. And I would say the same thing could be probably said of African Americans. Their kind of understanding of race issues in a world where they're minorities in this country, and or it could be said of Hispanics or Asians or any kind of um any sort of minority group, Jews in a Christian culture, you you're going to probably better understand the dominant culture than the dominant culture is gonna understand you.
And it's funny because I think that that is what you just described as something that I absolutely did not understand before starting to do this work 2 decades ago. Like and it's because do you remember you facilitated a program that Phyllis Schlafly's niece Suzanne Vinker was a panelist for,
Right,
and she had written, and then she also said to me, maybe coming back from the event. Um, Something to the effect of, I if you're liberal, you don't see that you're in the dominant culture, and conservatives like me are used to going into rooms like that's what I expected,
right.
and because I know that my culture isn't the dominant one, and I think she said something like, "Fish don't understand what water is," right? And and I don't think I experienced that until I started trying to sort of look at the world through conservative eyes, and I'm not conservative. I haven't changed my opinion on things, but I feel like I have empathy for the rooms that they come into and how they feel and the broader culture around them. Every movie they watch, every just liberals won the culture, right?
So that last point I think is really key to this because it sometimes I have found is hard for my liberal friends to understand this because they look at things and say, "Hey, wait a minute. You know, if you go back over the last 50 years, if you're coming at these conversations thinking strictly about politics and who has political power, you could easily, I think, fall into the trap of thinking, oh, well, this is a kind of 50-50 country. Sometimes the Republicans win, sometimes the Democrats win. You can go back in my lifetime and find just about as many presidential candidates of one party that have won as presidential candidates of the other party. And so in our politics, things are relatively close. Okay. I mean, look at the US House these days, and for that matter, US Senate. They're both, I mean,
Right.
narrow, very narrow margins. So y- you could easily think, oh, well, then this we I think a lot of times liberals don't feel like they are in the dominant position.
Because of
Uh,
political power.
right,
Yes.
because right now Trump's in power and
Right,
both houses are controlled by Republicans.
right.
If anything, liberals feel like we're in the minority. But when you then broaden the lens and say, no, 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 we're not just talking here about politics and about who's got governing power. We're talking here about the larger culture that we live in. and who is controlling the kind of narrative shaping industries, the mass media, the arts and entertainment sector, Hollywood and music and things of that nature. Who has the dominant hand in academia at both higher ed, K-12? And I think in all of those areas, there has been, kind of growing liberal dominance over the last 50 years, even while politics has kind of gone back and forth. And so I mean, but conservatives are well aware of this. And I think this is part of the reason why the speaker that you're describing had that reaction. Because, yeah, the current balance of power in Washington might be relatively close, but the current balance of power in Hollywood and the current balance of power in academia and the current balance of power in journalism or mass media, I mean, it ain't even close.
Well, and if you feel like it's you're living inside of this culture, I mean, the number of hours a day that a conservative finds themselves surrounded by this is pretty substantial, right? And so it's just everywhere. And so if the culture feels like an acid bath to you, right? Then that's a pretty substantial thing.
Right.
Um, so I'm going to pause for a second because I do think in here somewhere is one little glimmer of how I think conservatives really misunderstand liberals.
Good.
And and that is, I think that, well, there are two aspects of this. One is I think that conservatives feel like it's a highly orchestrated plan against them, and it is simply not. Right? I remember hearing it's care and fairness as a cultural value played out into the world everywhere, right? And it's just the default setting. So to me, my liberal heart beats strongly for immigrants who are fleeing danger. And Um, and so that's all that is. I really believe it's even all that is about immigration policy that drives liberal leaders. I think I have never ever been in a room, and I used to do political things. I've never been in a room where someone said, if we can get more immigrants into the United States, then we'll win more elections.
Mm,
I don't think anybody's thinking of that.
mm.
And so I think conservatives perceive to be an organized plot, what is simply people behaving individually in their own lives and in their own institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a really good observation, and I think you're right. I do think that there are times when probably both sides, but your point's well taken. That the conservatives, I think, sometimes imagine liberals to be, shrewder and more devious,
yeah,
and is actually the case. And I guess one of the things that I'll say on this that I hope will come out of this really peculiar and very disturbing moment that we find ourselves in, where you have extremes on both sides that um have fallen into all of this kind of anti-Semitic Jewish conspiracy thinking. I hope that coming out of this, people will not only conclude that, oh, a lot of these diabolical schemes that people have cooked up in their minds about how, you know, the Jews are behind every problem known to man or whatever, that they'll likewise then say, wait a minute, if those things are not true, ha- ha- could it also be that on some of these other topics where we have imagined the worst in our opponents, it ain't really so?
yeah.
And yes, they have completely different worldviews and positions on issues and all the rest, but they aren't necessarily advancing those in these conspiracy theory ways.
I see very little of it now. I'm not in a lot of rooms like that anymore because of the work that I do, but I used to be, and I just I regularly hear the way that conservatives talk about liberals and kind of go, you're just not, it's just not that way, right?
Right.
So, and that, of course, if you perceive your political foe in that light, it accelerates things.
Yeah.
And so then sort of to my, and actually, you know what, I'm going to take a side route here because of what you said, because I thought it was such an insightful thing I heard. At some point in time, we've got this project, the God Squad, that you've been very involved with us from the very beginning. It's 15 years old now, and one of the co-founders of the God Squad was Rabbi Jack Romberg, who's a wonderful, big-hearted, kind of half and half politically rabbi. And I asked him one time it was me being naive because I think at a certain point in time, this was years ago, I kind of went, where is this coming from? I do not understand. As someone who grew up in the DC area and, two-thirds of my friends are Jewish or culturally Jewish minimally. To me, this sounded like something that just, I didn't understand it. It didn't compute in my brain. And he pointed me to a piece by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs,
Mhm.
who I can put this link in the show notes because it was a really good piece. And he explained it this way too. And essentially it boils down to um, Jews are the quintessential other
Mm,
across the world.
mm.
And that what happens in times like ours, when distrust is high, people don't feel connected to groups of people who keep them centered in that kind of reputational cost and behaving well, for not behaving well. And so it is more a marker of the times that anti-Semitism starts to rise again. And we're clearly in that time, and that we should see it as a marker of such.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
I think a lot of this phenomenon of kind of imagining the worst in the people that you're going up against, comes back in some ways to that previous conversation we were having about kind of who has the dominant upper hand or whatnot. If you are in a position where you feel vulnerable, your worst fears can kind of overtake you, and you can find it easy to look for, a scapegoat or
Yeah.
some sort of unfair activity on the part of someone out to get you. And I think that can happen in either direction. And I remember in thinking about this kind of upper hand sort of thing and how a lot of times liberals don't understand it because they don't consider all these cultural institutions and whatnot. I can't remember who it was that wrote this, but they were talking about how both sides in our day feel as though they are the embattled minority.
Absolutely.
And liberals do so because they look at Washington and they say, "We are, the Supreme Court, the House, the Senate, and the presidency are all in Republican conservative hands," or whatever. And then similarly, conservatives look at Hollywood and academia and mass media and all the rest and say, "We're the embattled minority." And if the only thing that we've got going for us is slight, majorities in
Mhm.
Washington, but barring that, it's, Katie bar the door. And so both sides kind of feel like embattled minorities, and they then have a tendency to say, "Oh, there's something sinister going on behind closed doors
Yes.
over there,
Yeah.
and that's the reason why everything that I care about is so
Yes.
threatened."
Yes, and that's an incredibly dangerous state of affairs,
Yeah,
right?
it is.
Because if instead of seeing that the power is distributed in different ways and that it would be understandable in different areas of society to feel like you don't have power and control, that would be a wonderfully nuanced way to see it, but we just don't see it that way. And instead, then if you come into an interaction um, with the sense that this is existential for your group because you are so powerless,
Right,
then it licenses you to behave in ways
right.
that are that make it so much worse. And then if you imagine how that looks to the other group who feels that they are the powerless ones. So this very powerful group is rising up in this very illiberal, aggressive behavior. So it has a tendency to just push the vicious cycle
Yeah.
faster and faster and faster in a
Well,
really tragic way, to my way of
yeah,
thinking.
and what also happens in the course of this is that people will then latch on to historical analogies that kind of accentuate the concern that they have. And sometimes those analogies may be fitting and appropriate, and yet other times maybe not. And
Yeah,
and I think this is where it's important for us to have, conversations with people that are looking at these sort of things from all different directions. Because, like, there are people who are looking at some of the things happening today in Washington and are saying, this is totally unprecedented. We are in a completely new age, all, hell has broken loose or whatnot. And then there are other people who I hear saying, well, this is probably not that different from what happened when FDR rose to power and began doing all sorts of things in a very aggressive fashion. And there was a kind of transfer of power from one side to another. And the folks that had previously been in charge or been in control had a very hard time with losing power,
yeah,
but that if that's what's happening now, no one should be surprised that there would be people who are upset by things that are going on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their worst fears are are true or valid or whatnot.
right,
Um,
right. And
it's
then
time.
yes, and then you throw in bad actors, right?
Yeah,
Who
yeah.
essentially make money, um, get clicks, or win elected office by propelling that misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And that is sadly what wins the day right now.
No, that's a very, very, very big part of our problem is that we have gone from a day that you and I know from, we grew up in a day when in an age of broadcasting where you
Yeah.
had, 3 or 4 major news networks that broadcast news for everyone, and they were seeking to get, broad groups of people to follow them. Whereas today we live in a age of narrow casting or narrow streaming, where
Mhm.
you're just trying to isolate that 1% that if you can get them to follow you, you can become extremely wealthy just by appealing to 1% of the public.
Absolutely.
And that often tends to cause people to want to one up the next guy and to be more extreme and more outlandish and all the rest. And you then end up having, like you say, bad actors who pollute the public discourse with misinformation and disinformation and, outright lies and all the rest. Um, and with just, uncharitable characterizations of other
Right.
people, and so you end up then with all the conspiracy theories and everything else that we find in our day, and you don't have the kind of, order that
Yeah.
existed previously. Now, some would argue that it's been important to have greater access for people who would have previously never been given a chance to be heard. It's important for them to now have opportunity, and I definitely think
Yes.
there's something to that.
Well, like you always say, sometimes the wisest idea comes from the extreme, so you
Yeah,
don't want them not in the room.
no, you don't, but you also don't want want what we have now.
No.
No.
No. Well, so this conversation also makes me think of the second thing, looping way back, that I do think that is kind of a fundamental misunderstanding from a conservative view about the destructive, vicious cycle we're in. And that is that, we've talked about how conservative power is all around us. You feel it everywhere. And I have empathized with conservatives, especially young conservatives. Like, we've done a lot of work on college campuses, And I feel for them because I feel like they're trying to figure out their way, making their way in the world. They have some conservative ideas. They feel like they cannot state them, right? They feel like that it's too dangerous for them as a human
Yeah.
to be able to say what they think. But it's kind of, I've learned to, watch movies and think, well, if I were conservative, how would I feel about this? And I have a lot of empathy. But this is cultural. Again, going back to this isn't intentional. This is cultural power that is kind of not controllable by any central effort, right? And and I think that in the conspiracy mindset on the right, or well, they have cultural power and it's all around me, it's everywhere, it's like this, um, you know, on top of me all the time, but so we have to get all this political power. Well, that it's not centralized anywhere, right? And so an example of nobody's making decisions about this. It's
Mm.
just the culture. And an example of that is I think sort of the quote unquote woke culture, for lack of a better term. From my perspective as an older liberal, you know, free speech used to be the argument that liberals made when
Yeah.
I was coming, right?
Yeah.
Coming up in that iconic picture of the people walking under the big arch at Berkeley, the protesters all dressed up fancy, like protesters don't dress up anymore. Um, but this is just a foundational principle of liberalism, and so from the very beginning, the idea that liberals were advocating illiberal beliefs on college campus, the very wellspring of free speech, where we ought to be, all the ideas ought to be in there, batting around in these wonderful young brains. It was awful to me,
Yeah.
right? And so, but what could I do about it? And I think I think that that's the way that most older liberals experience that moment. And for me, and I did get in front of audience and say, "Wow, I believe and care about all the things you believe and care about, but the way that you're trying to get there, in my opinion, violates our common principles, but it also, you're never going to get there that way.
Well,
You're feeding into the vicious cycle here."
yeah, and what's interesting here, I'd never really stopped to think about this, but someone said something recently that kind of got my attention. There was that basically that in some on some kind of cultural questions that are now being hotly contested, liberals have enjoyed the upper hand so long that they have kind of um, lost sight of the need to make the argument. And they basically just want to shut down anyone
Yes,
who
yes,
challenges the ideas
yes,
rather than to say, "No, let me help you understand
right.
why our ideas are superior." And that made an awful lot of sense I, uh, when I heard that, and I thought, "Okay, that's a danger that any one of us can fall into
Yeah,
on anything where we have an upper hand, is losing sight of the need to make an argument." And in some ways, what the person I was listening to was saying was, not only is it not seeing the need, but also losing the habit, or being out of practice. It was almost as if, and I can understand this. There are times when there'll be things that are contested that come out of left field that I'm thinking, this is just w- w- this is just wrong. Why are we even having this discussion? But it's kind of like all those uh, wonderful little uh, taboo scenarios that John Haidt has in his Righteous
yeah,
Mindset, where he gives you these situations and he asks you, "Hey, is there anything wrong here?" And so often you know, they're just so out of left field that you're like, well, yeah, there's something wrong here, but you don't have the argument ready because it's just, something that you never thought you'd
Yeah.
have to defend.
Yeah.
So, um, so yeah, we need to be in the habit of making arguments and realizing that just because a generation ago, some of these things that are now being contested were kind of commonly accepted, doesn't mean that you can't or don't have to, make the argument today.
Yeah, yes. In fact, what your observation reminds me of Arthur Brooks saying that he felt like he learned how to make arguments because he was a conservative on lots of liberal college campuses.
Yeah.
So he learned to jump in there and do it. And so if you're out of practice, but sort of adding to that too is the observation that because it is cultural power, things can happen that create a cultural moment that just moves.
Mm,
And I think to characterize all of the left in American political life as being part of the illiberal campus movement that was composed of largely young humans,
right.
I think is again another um, uh, throwing fire on as an accelerant
Yeah.
to a situation that is misdiagnosed. And then when you look at cultural power that say comes from a college campus and does pick up a certain amount of there were a certain amount of adult intellectuals who supported that idea. There were, I think, a certain number of college presidents that just didn't want to disrupt things, and so they, didn't say much. But I think the vast majority of Americans, and I think that the election proved this out, were very concerned
Mm,
with that particular movement that it was composed of a very small percentage of people. And then when you look at political power on the right, we have a rise of an extreme overreaction to what was a portion of society, but it is now power across all three branches of our government. And so to me, that is something that I wish conservatives understood a little bit more about where the liberal energy comes from.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's a tendency in our narrow casting age for each side to kind of cherry pick the worst examples that they can possibly find of
Indeed.
the other, hold them up as being representative of all folks.
Yep.
This is where not only should, you know, those that are being attacked try to distinguish, but what we really need are more people saying, wait a minute, you know, I know liberals, all liberals aren't like that, all conservatives aren't like that.
Yeah.
Don't paint with a broad brush. Distinguish people of goodwill who think differently from you from those that are, bad actors because we've got
Yeah.
enough of that.
Yeah. Completely agree. Um, and that's you do that only by having relationships. So you do that only by stepping outside of your front door and being engaged with people that, people who I have so many close relationships with people who disagree with me politically. I just cannot paint everybody with such a broad brush. Can't do it.
Right.
Um, so one of the things, two little random thoughts I wanted to, or maybe they're not little, but that I wanted to make sure that I threw into this conversation. One is that I think that we've touched on the concept of weird before in
Sure.
our series,
Yeah.
which and by weird I mean hold on, I'm going to get to the book by Joseph Henrich, which is The Weirdest People in the World: How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and particularly prosperous. And so weird stands for Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. And the thesis of his book, I'll just read this real quick, is unlike much of the world today and most people who have ever lived, weird people are highly individualistic, self obsessed, control oriented, nonconformist, and analytical. Actually, the analytical to me is really important.
Mm.
They focus on themselves, their attributes, accomplishments, and aspirations over their relationships and social roles. So, another thing that I've come to believe in this work is that I think Americans and in the Western educated elite are definitely the unusual people, right? Relative to other people. And to me, in my work, I liken it to those stereogram pictures
Oh, yeah, sure.
that you can see one picture in it, and then if you
Yeah.
change your focus,
The
all of a
old
sudden,
lady, the young lady, the yellow dress, the other
yes,
dress, yeah.
yes. So I've learned through the years that I can zoom in and out of thinking weird and thinking non-weird. And, and thinking weird is what comes more naturally to me, and again, it's analytical. It's, "I know these facts, I need to solve this problem with a policy." I'm gonna make a 10-point list of things, and in some ways, it was the genesis of the idea of the village square, right? "To the village square," the Einstein quote, "To the village square, we must carry the facts of atomic energy. From there must come America's voice." I just thought we needed facts because 'cause I'm a good weird person. But one of the things I've observed is, the our last episode on groupishness. I have observed, consistent with John Haidt's moral foundations theory, that conservatives see the groupishness a little bit better. They can zoom out and they see a little bit more of a holistic picture sometimes. And so while all the Western world is weirder, I think liberals are even weirder. And I think it's one of the things that makes us think individualistically, think to do therapy in moments like this, instead of thinking groupishly as how do we do this as a whole with a higher purpose. Um, and so I think that and I see so many, John's examples, like you said, the moral examples in his book. He talks about people being kind of like not being able to explain at all,
Right.
right? They're just like, I really can't come up with anything of why this is true. I have seen that kind of true, earnest, well-meaning blindness among, in particular, liberal academics, colleagues who are thinking in a very analytical way about this
Mm.
and are not practiced at being able to see that stereogram. And I think inside that stereogram and actually this is coming to my second point, things that weirder than I can explain. I have actually come around to agree with conservatives on certain very foundational things about the moment we're in. And I think if you pull out a lot of the kind of ick that comes out in the political cycle, conservatives are pretty deeply concerned about what I'm concerned about and what you're concerned about, which is we've lost our connectedness inside groups as a part of this American idea.
Yeah, no, I think well, I think this was part of what, kind of, helped Haidt, is that, he goes and spends a long time in India and kind of is in a completely different world observing their practices, and I think many of the practices that were not weird, but were, much more holistic and all that,
Yeah.
kind of, um centering the interest of the community rather than the individual and some of those sorts of things. Many of those habits and practices kind of came out of the spiritual or religious life of the people there in India, and I think he came back then with a better understanding, perhaps, of how to view at least religious conservatives. And I think a lot of the things that you're
Mm.
saying there about understanding or appreciating, the whole rather than just the individual or the group, rather than just the individual or the community, um, as well as kind of the need to uphold certain traditions and rituals and common sources
Yes.
of meaning and memory and things of that nature,
Yes.
I think very much do play to conservative strengths and perhaps especially religious conservatives, strengths. And so,
And and
yeah,
it's also in this sort of dynamic that I'm painting where liberals are not super intentional about this, we're just blind to it. I think it creates an environment where conservatives can feel more and more panicked that they are not understood.
Yeah.
And think of it like the kind of, I mean, you hear some scary things right now, about people who are detaching themselves from the American idea. And so to me, I think they are mistaking blindness to groupish values and norms for intentional desire to destroy them.
Yeah.
And I think they're two very different things. I think it creates the tragic environment that we see around us.
Yeah, and it's easy to understand why, um, wh why liberals would have difficulty here from the standpoint that, when you were going through the litany of kind of traits and focused, and I think you're right, on kind of analytical. Well, I mean, who's against analysis? I mean,
Right.
we all benefit
Right.
from careful reasoning and, and analytical thinking, and so it's easy, I think, especially in educated circles where you're trying to solve problems, you're trying to, come to conclusions and whatnot, find truth. I think it's easy for someone to think, okay, I'm um I'm able to see things that someone who's less educated, less analytical, less observant can't see, and therefore my way of looking at things is superior. And what I hear you saying is, no, 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 no. You're seeing one of the dresses really well, but you're missing the other one. And sometimes
Yes.
those who who come at life from a less analytical point of view and have a more intuitive sense of things, or have been kind of brought up to more highly elevate the interests of the community or other traditions or whatnot. There's something to that perspective as well,
Yes.
and so it's not an either or, it's a both and. But you can
Absolutely.
but a lot of times I think people who kind of who see what they see sometimes can not understand why others don't give it the same
I think that's right.
priority that
Like,
they
if it's
do.
sitting right there and you see the picture of the young woman and you say, "Can't you see it?"
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it is, but if you start understanding it as being sort of a lot of the, I mean, the book, the Weird Book talks about how we're particularly prosperous, right? Some of the things that we do that are creating this kind of blindness are also created, a society that is very prosperous. So there's sort of, good parts and bad parts about it, but if only conservatives could better see, they're not understanding what I'm saying. So I'm gonna try to put it through in a different way. And if I'm any example, again, I feel like I can move back and forth, and it doesn't make me agree with conservatives most of the time, although on this issue I do. But it makes me empathize with them.
yep,
It makes me see that their intentions are good and they're coming from a place of true, good intention. And to me, that changes everything. So if I'm trainable, then I believe other liberals are too. And so I can't, if you can bear with me for 1 second, there's one little thing I want to, for posterity, put into this. As And that is that, so I don't remember if I ever shared this article with you, um, but it was right after the 2016 election, and the world was kinda going, "Huh, what happened?" And it was after Brexit, and it's a piece, called "The Rise and Fall of European Meritocracy" in the New York Times, and I'm sorry I did not get the author, but I will put that in the show notes too. And he's trying to explain the rise of populism around the globe. And he wrote, Successful Dutch bankers moved to London. Competent German bureaucrats moved to Brussels. European institutions and banks, just like soccer clubs, got the sports metaphor for you, Bill, spend colossal amounts of money acquiring the best players. But what happens when the teams start to lose or the economy slows down? Their fans abandon them. That's because people trust their leaders not only because of their competence, but also because of their courage and commitment, and because they believe that their leaders will remain with their own in times of crisis rather than being helicoptered to the emergency exit. So there's no relationship connecting players to their fans beyond celebrating their victories. And so to me, I sent this around to as many people as I could, because to me, that was a moment where liberal me could say, that's what that is. It is the loss of community connectedness. And also, as a kid who grew up in DC when the Redskins were really bad, there's this certain we're in this together kind of thing, and that people don't feel that anymore because of the concern that both the Village Square and conservatives feel, and I think liberals do too when they focus on it, with a loss of community and how we've got to build that back, and then um, maybe as it should be. That brings us back around to our very first flying pig topic, which was location, location, location.
It's great.
Any final parting thoughts? And thanks for letting me get that.
Yeah,
I
no,
love that piece. I reread it
no,
every once in a while.
no, it's a great it's a great insight. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about, in some ways, I think this is why a lot of blue collar folks felt really betrayed by the, outsourcing of all sorts of industry in other
Yeah,
countries, and a sense that, hey, wait a minute, why aren't American companies, looking out for us? We live here. We should have a greater that they should be more interested in our lives rather than just going and finding the cheapest labor they can
yep.
somewhere else.
Loyalty,
Yep,
binding moral
exactly,
foundation. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, it's true, and it's humans are, if you really understand where people are and where they've come from, and we let people explain themselves, that we mostly make sense.
Yeah, yeah,
Something we probably should, generosity we should probably all give each other in this difficult time.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Bill, for hanging
Thank you
again.
as always. Enjoy it.
Uh, I don't know where the enrollment of Flying Pig Academy would be without you.
Oh, I've thoroughly enjoyed these conversations.
Have a good one.
You too. We'll see you.
All right. Well, that was wonderful. I expected nothing less, of course. Corey Nathan back with you. One of the recurring themes in this conversation is how quickly entire groups of people get flattened into caricature. There is a human impulse to distill the supposed other side into something tidy and coherent, even though real people, that it just doesn't work that way. Liz and Bill explored this. So you always you can always win me over with a Jonathan Haidt reference. So Jonathan Haidt's image of moral foundations working like sliders on a soundboard is really helpful here. Care, fairness, loyalty, authority, liberty, sanctity. Different people turn those dials up and down in different ways. And trouble begins when it becomes impossible to imagine how someone else could arrive at a different conclusion using a different combination of the same ingredients, of the same moral ingredients. Another tension running through this conversation is a feeling of being surrounded by a culture that doesn't see you. Conservatives often describe living in a liberal-dominated culture, or a world shaped by Hollywood, academia, media, technology. And liberals, meanwhile, can find themselves in rooms where a very particular version of conservatism is assumed to be the default. And when in those situations, the expression keeps going through one's mind. Do you hear yourselves? Do you see yourselves? An outsider's perspective can be healthy. It can challenge assumptions that have gone largely unquestioned. But when the sense of being surrounded turns into a belief that there's a single, coordinated, homogenous enemy called the left, or the right for that matter, understanding collapses. Add to that a media ecosystem that rewards outrage, rewards distortion, and what some call nut picking. We've talked about that before, which is the habit of selecting the worst possible example of the other side and treating it as representative of everyone. A healthier way to do this, a healthier discipline, is modeled by folks like great writers and thinkers like E.J. Dionne or Yasha Monk. What they do is they have a tendency to articulate the strongest arguments of those they are just about to disagree with, to engage real ideas, the most robust interpretation of those ideas to engage with, rather than straw men. And that shift alone can lower the temperature and open the door to something more constructive, which is what we're trying to do here. So with that, it is time to close out today. Please consider joining our members and supporting this programming. You can become a member for just $7 a month or $76 a year, and your business can join for $250. Just go to villagesquare.us/donate to join today. And while you're there, sign up for Village Square's newsletter to stay up to date with everything happening at the Village Square. Just go to villagesquare.us and scroll to the bottom for that sign up box. It's also really easy because there's a pop-up just when you go right to villagesquare.us. Village Squarecast is funded in part by Florida Humanities with support from Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Mellon Foundation. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of our funders. Learn more about Florida Humanities at floridahumanities.org. We appreciate you listening to Conservative 101 for Liberals and Liberal 101 for Conservatives, or Empathy 101 for everyone. Until next time, we challenge you to reach out with an open heart and mind to someone who doesn't look or think like you. It changes everything. We'll talk to you soon, and thanks so much for listening to Village Squarecast.